So I'm here chatting to Anne-Marie Forsyth from the CCA. And I'm here just going to ask her a couple of questions to hear her view and her members of what they're seeing in service at the moment. So thank you, Anne-Marie.
Hi there.
So really, I would be very interested to hear from you. What are the biggest barriers and the biggest concerns that you're hearing from your members in preventing them from getting to the type of service delivery that they aspire to?
It's lots of things. I suppose disconnect is one thing. So lots of systems have been set up over many years with fantastic intentions, but they don't necessarily all connect in the way that they should. And throughout the pandemic, when this issue really has come to the fore, when people have had to act at speed and to get to the bullseye, if you like, of service and changing operations and so forth, then that's when a lot of it has been laid bare. So people who perhaps haven't invested or have been slow to look at what they've been doing or had big plans have had to accelerate those plans hugely. So that's one thing. And I think the other big challenge obviously is the new working models, which for many people are working really well, but they were put in haste and in response to the lockdown. We're now 15, 16 months into it. And for many, the options and the big issues for them are how can they actually use the knowledge of what they've known over the last little while to have an effective customer solution. So there's a lot of energy just now into the planning, the learning from what has happened and the planning. These are some of the really big issues.
And do you think the problems have been delayed and pushed down the road and are going to start to uncover as we move back to whatever our new normal might look like?
Yeah, I think there's lots and lots of issues around the sort of the join part, as I would call it, between automation and human and who can do what. And I think that there's quite a lot, there's not been perhaps enough thoughts about how we use technology to support our human endeavour. And we need to think much, much more creatively about that. You've also got, as a result of the pandemic, a lot of people who've been working in customer service, working tirelessly, if you like, in customer service, and perhaps not feeling as appreciated as they should be because they're largely invisible. So I think there's quite a lot of that pent up stuff that's perhaps going to emerge as we move into a new phase.
What would you say are the top factors that are guiding businesses across the CCA and are top of mind for their future aspirations?
Okay, well, right now the CCA network is heavily engaged in our Future Scenarios programme. And we've accelerated that programme, like everything else has been accelerated. And we're now just about to go into the fourth section, which is service reset. So the first one looked at changing customer expectations. The next one looked at the whole leadership piece. We're looking at just service as is. And what's coming out of the scenarios really is that there are people right now are desperately looking to see what everybody else is doing before they press go buttons. So I think that's number one. That's always been the case, but it's now very, very urgent. There's a really urgent need. Some of this sort of glow around the early ages of everybody feeling appreciated in the first few months of pandemic has definitely gone. And there's a very, very demanding customer base now wishing to have their normal service. And of course, that's causing quite a bit of angst because you've got a lot of people now in very disrupted models and not quite sure where they're going. Now that's beginning to settle. And the conversation, I think, has turned more from a tactical work at home, don't work at home, hybrid, not hybrid. It's turned on to what is the best way of organising our workforce to get the maximum efficiency and the best well-being for our workforce at the same time. What is the best way we can achieve that? And I think that's a much more interesting discussion than the more tactical, how many days here, how many days there. I think it's moved on, and I think that's a positive. And that's coming out of the scenario programme, the future of work. It's very positive, actually.
Good, yeah, good to hear. Because I think there is a lot of fear from companies of being the first to call everyone back to the office, being called out in the press. So it puts a lot of pressure, and I think is holding back customers from making some of these decisions as well, and also a lot more pressure to align with your customers' values these days.
Yeah, and customer values are interesting because you've got customer values now which are much more local than before because people are at home and they're communicating much more with their own community, their families, their community, and their value system perhaps has been reevaluated. And I think there's a lot there. There's a lot, let's face it, there's a lot for organisations. If you think about, there's been 20 years of what we thought was quite progressive change in the whole world of CX, and then in 2 years that pace has just gone off a scale. And so it's important, I think, that people learn fast but also take stock of lots of stuff that's going on around about them and don't be necessarily governed by just what's happening in your sector or previous things that you thought are still relevant. I think people do need to take a fresh look. They really do.
We've seen a lot of customers interested from learning from each other and not in their own sector, but actually who's reacting fast, who's been able to nearly make the most of these opportunities to progress their service, to build in agility. How can they learn from each other in that way? So it's very interesting.
Yeah, it's good. The learning together, and obviously that's what CCA is all about, collaboration. And so we found our engagement over the last 12 months has been, it's off the scale, and it's extended to such a level. But what I'm really encouraged to hear, and I hear a lot of it now, is that finally organisations have perhaps appreciated what goes on in customer operations. They're appreciating what happens in there. They're interested, and many more people in an organisation who perhaps weren't particularly customer focused, are now becoming so. So this, so you're starting to see a lot of that, and it's almost like a full circle to before we had contact centres, and now we have distributed services, and we're kind of starting to go back to more people being involved, but using technology as the bind and the enabler to make it all happen.
And so what do you think, Anne-Marie? Do you think customers will take a stance to keep service human, or do you think big tech will override?
It's a really interesting question, and we tend to, when we think about that question, think of two ends of a spectrum, whereas for the vast majority of customers, they're somewhere in the middle and they move back and forward. I think there's absolutely no doubt that throughout this pandemic, all customers, all organisations that we deal with have been much more brave in their technology applications. So they have done much more digitally. They've had to make things work. And in many cases, they've been pleasantly surprised that what they've done has worked really well. So I think that's it. But at the same time, you've got an opposite and equal arrow, which is about vulnerability and customers feeling that perhaps they don't have such a great deal from organisations. Think of travel industry, think of tourists, think of all the things that people have been, concerned about. So you've got this need to reserve your human capital, if you like, for emotion and to make people, to reassure people, to make people feel good, to keep relationships going. But we need to get rid of the stuff that basically should be done and should be done in an automated way. So I don't think it's really a battle. I think it's more of a sifting exercise. It's more of an educational process. And I think that, we're certainly hearing that, organisations can't get enough of the right type of people to handle the very complex and very emotional inquiries that are as a result of everything that's been going on, and we would expect that. But there's also, as I said earlier, a real bravery. So I think it's much more of an education about sifting, I would call it, sifting exercise, rather than one versus another. I think that's where we are at the moment.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's that balance of automation with the human touch, but also actually how automation can enhance the human touch. If more is taken off the place of agents, if their job is made easier, they have more time to interact and to build those relationships and to support the vulnerable in their base, as you've said.
Yeah, and of course regulation will have a huge part to play in this, because the sector regulators are obviously hugely involved just now in the whole fairness to customer agenda, particularly around vulnerability and particularly post-pandemic. So I think there's many more reasons now to have a much more educated debate, a much more real debate, rather than this sort of rather old-fashioned man versus machine, which I think these days is maybe not quite so relevant.
Yeah, much more nuanced.
Yeah, absolutely.